So, when I mentioned the list of episodes I was going to be working on, and my whole I'm going to challenge myself to find something good in them thing, I got a little bit of flack for that for this episode right here, Resistance, because there were a few people I know personally and a few people online who messaged me, basically telling me how they felt that that was unfair because they liked Resistance. I just felt like I'd address that right now because it's actually very easy to understand why someone would like this episode, and I mean that sincerely. My biggest problem with this episode could be best summarized by one simple sentence: poor execution. Before I really go into, I just wanted to address that right off the bat and explain that just because I groan at this episode doesn't mean I'm looking down upon you for liking it, okay? And indeed, there are parts of this episode I liked. It's funny because when I fired this episode up to start watching it, because I watched these immediately before. I mean, I just finished it like 5 minutes ago. When I watched these episodes for these videos, sometimes on several of these episodes, I find myself just like, and I feel like I just want to start skipping through, and I keep resisting the urge. But this one was a really bad one for that. I was like, Resistance, all right, whatever, whatever. And I was like, no, 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 no. I need to actually pay attention. I'm kind of glad I did, because I think this is definitely going to be a different one for the then and now thing. But I'm getting ahead of myself because I know this has kind of become a trend lately. I apologize, but I really want to talk about something that is related to this episode that isn't directly related to this episode. You know where I'm talking about. I've been doing this several times. We're talking about bad writing, good writing, etc. Let's talk about budget. I thought I would start this discussion with an example. There was a television show called Space Above and Beyond. It was a really good show. If you find yourself liking speculative fiction, science fiction, or military fiction, or any combination of the above, I strongly recommend you find a copy of it somehow and go ahead and give it a watch. I will warn you, the show was canceled, so the story is incomplete. And if that bothers you like it does, I don't know, me, then maybe you should go ahead and stay away. But if you at least can find it in yourself to watch one episode, I recommend you do so you understand the full totality of my point here and the true, I'll just be blunt, tragedy of television. And that tragedy is budget. Those of you who already know what Space Above and Beyond is know exactly what I'm going to say already, but for those of you who don't, I will enlighten you in brief. It was a fantastic show, well written, well directed, well performed, and it had great special effects, and it went way over budget constantly, and that's why it was brought off the air. I know that some people have haggled and argued over the specifics and the technical details, but the bottom line is over budget, off air. None of the rest of that really matters when it comes down to it. Any television show, with like very few exceptions, is a slave to its budget. This is the great tragedy of television, in my opinion, because no matter what you try to do, you always have to be keeping that number in mind. Now, some shows do things where their budget is per episode. The BBC did this for a while, for example, with Doctor Who and with I suddenly can't think of the name. It was another British television show, not speculative fiction. It was more of a soap drama. But anyways, some shows will do it per episode budget. That usually allows you a little more leniency because that's usually the networks that can do that basically are flush for money and it's for a very popular show, so they can go ahead and give you more budget to work with. The other 80% of the time, you have a per season budget. And the way this works is this is your money for the entire season. You have to make however many episodes within this season with this amount of money. Now, this is a pseudo-malleable number. You can try to beg and barter and work your way with the people in order to change this number, but for the most part, this is pretty much where it's at. And if you beg and barter, it's usually just going to be for a little bit extra for one episode, basically, is what I'm getting down to. So, there's an old saying, vision has to take second seat to budget. And I hate that saying because it's absolutely true. Star Trek has always had this problem. It has probably had this problem more than most television shows I've seen. Star Trek often feels very small because of that budget problem. Now, you probably are wondering why I'm bringing this up specifically. I want to mention one other thing really quick, though. Just as kind of an informative thing for those of you who are not aware of this. To give you a modern example, even Battlestar Galactica, which I know isn't like that modern, but a few years ago, Battlestar Galactica had this exact same problem. That was a per season budget, and they wanted to do several things for several episodes, and they basically couldn't. They had to hold back so they would have the extra money available for this big thing they were doing here or this big thing they were doing here. It's just the nature of the business. And well, let's just move on because there's 2 points where that really comes up, and this episode it feels incredibly blatant, if you'll forgive me for using such a term. Part of that probably has to do with the sets and designs they use for this place. Part of it is most likely because of having 2 guest stars. And I know that sounds weird, but having 1 guest star is usually something that you can cover. But that's a big chunk of a budget, usually a guest star. Having 2 guest stars, that usually is the budget. So it makes sense what happened with this episode. But let me move on here, okay? Star Trek has 2 big problems that even Trekkies and Trekkers tend to agree on. There's the hat problem, and there's the one face problem. Now, some of you probably already know what I'm talking about, so forgive me for elaborating on something you already understand. The hat problem, there's a term called the planet of the hats. It means everyone of this race wears this particular hat. It's kind of a synopsis of a character. Rather than actually fleshing out a whole species, they just kind of make a few standard characterizations, and that's that. This isn't exclusive to Star Trek. Most things do this because, in general, in most fiction, unless you're going to spend a long time developing an alien culture, to be a little bit blunt, it's easier to just go ahead and put a hat on them and say this. And I understand that. And the main reason that tends to happen is exactly what I just mentioned. When you only have a limited amount of time and budget in order to spend on someone, what are you going to spend it on? Your main story, character development, or fleshing out the culture of the Hungabaws that you just passed and are only going to be in 1 episode? You see where I'm going with this. So it is very understandable. The second problem is the one-face problem, and this happens a lot in Star Trek. Voyager is really bad about this one. Let's say we're encountering a new alien race, so we're going to meet with Bob. Do I have a... Okay, Bob here. Just go with it. Bob here is going to be the face for this new alien culture. We will see a few extras, maybe even some people with some lines for space, but for all of our interactions of the crew and thereby the viewers, interactions with this space is going to be with this person. He's the mushroom people or something. I don't know. Just go with it. So this can work if done properly, and it can also fall completely flat on its face if it doesn't work properly. And this is what I'm getting to in a nutshell here, to be completely honest with you. Any of the arguments and complaints I could level at this episode or other episodes of Voyager could also be leveled on paper at several episodes of Deep Space Nine, Next Generation, even original series, and could be done so validly. The problem is, as I mentioned right at the beginning, execution. If you have a problem like one face, or this is the hat, and this is their only hat of these particular people, that is easier to tolerate or understand or just kind of go with if the episode itself is better. If there's better acting, if there's better writing, if the overall presentation is better, then we can skip those things. There's an episode called First Contact in The Next Generation, which I think is an excellent example of what I'm talking about. Now, that episode actually had like 4 guest stars. Otherwise, it was pretty much a complete bottle show. By the way, I'm sorry, I never defined that term. For those of you who don't know, a bottle show refers to an episode where you basically cut back on expenses. No fancy effects, no ship battles, no anything. This is true. This isn't just true for science fiction. This is true across all fiction. You basically cut back on all the extraneous stuff, sets, location, shooting, that sort of thing, and just have a show about characters and basically talking with each other. Those kind of shows tend to be either really, really boring if they're done poorly, or really, really awesome if they're done properly, because they tend to be very character-based. Duet, Deep Space Nine, Season 1. That's a good example of a bottle show. Forgive me, let's move on. So, First Contact very much had the Prime Minister guy, who was the guy, and all of the species their hat was basically the fact that they were humans for all intents and purposes, and that's not a great example of the hat thing. There are better examples of that. I'm not going to get into that. That's not the relevant point. The point is, even though we had the same general problems in that episode, we could go with it, or at least I could, personally, because I like First Contact, because it was such a fascinating episode, because it was such an interesting insight into the Federation, into the Prime Directive, into First Contact, the very concept of First Contact, which is one of the most important concepts in Star Trek, and has been since forever. I mean, after all, the disastrous First Contact with the Klingons led to war. Just to use one example. And never mind the First Contact with the Romulans. So, you get where I'm going with this, right? In an episode like Resistance, those little details that normally you could just kind of go by and just kind of get nagging. So this one guy, I don't even remember his name. He's been on Star Trek a couple more times as a Romulan actually. Um, this one guy who is the face for this place, it just gets kind of silly, and you constantly see this guy. Okay, wandering the streets. He's the one who's wandering the streets personally. He's the one actually interrogating the new people. He's the one bullying this guy. He's the one contacting alien races. He's the one that is there when the place is under attack. You know, he is literally the face of the thing, and it's so in your face, no pun intended, that it just gets kind of ridiculous. But then we have the other problem of these people. These people actually have two hats, and this is something that sometimes is done as well, although it sometimes gets equally ridiculous because the contrast just throws it in you see, let me just explain. We have the hat of the total Nazi fascists, and then we have the hat of the French resistance, to put it bluntly. And that's not a French joke, by the way. I actually know enough about World War II to not make French jokes. Thank you very much. So, we've got these two hats going on here. And that's it. That's the full characterization we receive for any of these people. The Nazi people are stupidly evil, and the resistance people are brave and strong, and they're going for this thing. And while you might consider that a good thing, that's all the characterization they reveal. So basically, if to get my point across, it feels like we're looking at cardboard cutouts rather than people. This is something I've talked about a lot in video games and movies and books and in television shows. There's a difference between a set of bullet points and a person, And it just feels particularly grating in this episode. And that's one of the biggest reasons why this episode tends to grate on me. Now, told you guys that I would try to pull something positive out of each of these episodes as a challenge to myself. I'll be honest, Resistance was the easy one, because I already knew what the positive thing was going to be. There's a scene in this episode that actually made me tear up. I admit that freely and without question or hesitation. I'm going to go ahead and point to two scenes in specific, but let me just talk about this blank, because this is a long point, okay? This episode was originally pitched as an idea that basically was solely focused on the story between the old man, Calum, I believe his name was, and B'Elanna Torres, who was the original person who was supposed to be. Jerry Taylor took that and swapped Torres out for Janeway, so it became a Janeway and Calum story. And the original core story that this was centered around their interactions and the tragedy that he had gone through and the horrible the viewpoint of his human suffering, to put it simply, and the tragedy of it and the circumstances that allow such a thing to come to be, that kind of thing, right? Kind of standard, a little cliche, but nevertheless well done enough that you can overlook that sort of thing, at least in my opinion. Then it was handed off to Lisa Klink. Now, Lisa Klink is an interesting writer, and when I was actually preparing my notes for this, I actually have a note there that says Lisa Klink, sorry, because I always feel bad criticizing other people's writing, because I myself have so little self-confidence about my writing, and when people level criticism, valid criticisms, mind you, at my writing, it just devastates me, because I already think I write crap, you know what I mean? And so, not that I'm trying to say I just want positive feedback. That's not the problem. The problem is me. The problem is I have such a... You get where I'm going with it, but that's off topic. My point I'm trying to make here is that I always feel bad criticizing other people's work, even if I feel that is valid criticism. But when I look at Lisa Klink, I feel like she is a fascinating writer because she is the kind of writer who can really latch on to something that is interesting and engaging and push that forward, but she has no idea how to actually get that onto the screen. Now, this is something I've seen writers have a problem with in general. They'll write a great idea or a great concept or whatever, but when it actually comes down to putting it to paper, they just can't manage that. It just kind of falls a little bit flat. So in this particular episode, the scenes between Janeway and Calum, the duet that the two are going through, are great. And like I said, one of them actually brought me to tears, or made me tear up a bit. A little bit. Manly man! No, seriously though, I have no shame admitting I was tearing up at this scene. It's the last one, in case you're wondering. Not the coda, the last scene between the two of the people. Very well done. But it feels lacking because it's mitered in this episode that just plain doesn't make sense. And that's what I'll start talking about as we go here. But I wanted to talk about the positive first. What we have is an excellent viewpoint of a man who has fallen so far into dementia that even when he tries to slip out of it, he can't do so without still coming off as both crazy and insane. What we have here is someone who is so far gone mentally and emotionally that there's basically nothing left of any kind of a person there. And the gentleman who plays this role, Gray, I believe was his name. I was looking this up earlier. It does a phenomenal role of playing this gentleman who is just basically gone. That for all intents and purposes, there is no person there left. It's just this broken mess that's been trying to go on. And for those of you, spoiler alert, for those of you who aren't aware, the fact was his wife died 12 years prior fighting the Nazis of Nazism, Nazi hat, and his daughter went to go and recruit her, had also died in the result of this, and he just basically could not take that. There's a scene in this episode where he worries that he hadn't written his most recent letter to them, and he starts trying to remember what was in the letter, and the way he says it, he's so quiet and he's so introspective as he's like, it was about the sweater, I need to tell her about the sweater, and how I did this and that, and there was something across the street I wanted to tell her, and blah blah blah. And Janeway is just thinking about her way forward, but the way he is so quietly earnest in his attempts to remember what he was going to write in the letter that part of him knows is invalid because he is aware of the fact that she is gone, which the majority of his mind cannot accept, it comes across beautifully. And in the final scene where the man dies, I'd like to take a moment and say that, and you may think of me a horrible person for this, but I was very glad that he died, because that was a mercy at that point in time. Someone who is that far gone, someone who has spent 12 years in agony, death is a release at that point. And he died well. He died at peace because of Janeway's final words to him, because she understood, the character understood. Mulgrew does a great job of that. I'm actually tearing up thinking about this. Mulgrew does such a great job of this scene when she's down there and she tells him, don't worry. And there's a hesitance, and you can see her accept the truth of what she's trying to get across as she lies bald-faced to him and says, Father. Because at that moment, the truth stopped mattering to her just like it had stopped mattering to him. And at that moment, she cared more about him and his well-being and his peace of mind in his final moments than telling him the truth. And it comes off brilliantly in her performance. It's a great scene. It literally was worth watching this episode just for those scenes. Now I'm going to tear the episode a new one. I've talked before about the idea that at the beginning of an episode, you have the teaser, right? And I've talked extensively about good teasers and bad teasers. I've never talked about a teaser like this. I call this the groan teaser, okay? The groan teaser is one where it's like, all right, here we are, acting kind of weird and kind of poorly, and no one look at us, and oh my God, stuff's happening! The end. I don't actually know how to prefer. The word I want to use is awkward. The entire teaser seemed extremely awkward, from the them sneaking around to the little vial of Parmesan or whatever it was that Neelix had. Yeah, I know it was Tellurite, or Tellurium, excuse me. The whole thing just came across as like, okay. And then they have this ridiculous fight scene, which is so typically Star Trek. I've talked about this before, but for those of you who don't know, Star Trek characters, I swear, they only have like 3 fighting moves. There's the kunk straight to the stomach, and then there's the kunk straight to the face, right? And occasionally they'll do the kunk when someone's already bolted over from this, like this. I don't want to give away too much about my personal life, but I know what fighting is actually like in real life, and it is absolutely nothing like that. So every time I see that, I just kind of have to grin a bit. I'm not going to hold that against the episode. Star Trek in general has been doing that since forever. It's just funny to me every time I see it. And then Janeway gets shot. Ugh! And then, oh, don't hurt her! And then it cuts to... It was just groan-inducing, because the whole thing felt awkward and rushed, and like they were trying to catch your attention, but they don't actually know what it is that is catching your attention, so they just kind of start flinging stuff at the wall to see what will stick. Let's also talk about another problem. This is another thing I've noticed Lisa Klink has a problem with. Or actually, I don't want to blame her in specific, but several of the other episodes she's done, even very good ones like Warlord, which is an episode I very much like, have this same kind of problem with what I like to call the artificial dilemma. Now, I've talked before about Technobabble. I don't want to get into that whole horse. I don't want to beat that dead horse some more again. What I do want to say is when you have a Technobabble problem that is solved by a Technobabble solution in 5 minutes. Now, okay, some of you out there are probably already defending this, but for those of you who haven't seen this episode, let me elaborate just a little bit. They need this tellurium, or whatever, however you pronounce it, in order to stabilize the warp core. The details don't matter, okay? They want it to stabilize the warp. It's some crap we've never heard before, ever, that is needed to keep the warp core from shutting down permanently. I want to stress that word because that's part of what I find ridiculous about it. That the warp core will shut down forever, totally irreparable, if they don't get this stuff in it within like 10 minutes or 15 minutes or half an hour, or a day, or whatever the timeline is, doesn't matter. They are permanently screwed forever unless they get it in here. And keep in mind that the situation has gotten to this point and now they're trying to fix it. That's another thing that I find a little bit ridiculous. And it's one of those things that strikes me as the problem of this type of writing, because ultimately, not only does it not really make sense, but the more you think about it, the less sense it makes. Then they get the tellurium up with Neelix, because Neelix is the only one who got away from the teaser. Hang on. There we go. And then the problem's solved. I get the point, okay? This is what I call A to B writing. I've actually talked about this before. When you need to get from point A on the Voyager ship and, flying throughout the galaxy to point B, desperate situation, you need to have the crew, you need to have Janeway interact with this guy, you need to have the prison. All of these pieces are necessary for this story to happen. A good writer, who I am not in this case, I actually have a problem with this as well, I've mentioned before, so don't think I'm throwing glass stones. Or glass stones, stones from my glass house. But what I'm trying to get across here is the idea that this is a difficult thing to do in writing. Get from point A to point B and make it make sense. Make it be logical and deductive. And okay, yeah. Don't make it so that there's this artificial problem that came out of nowhere that makes no sense, that has never happened before, that's just inconsequential, and then is solved almost immediately just so that now we can get on with the episode. It felt so trivial that I seriously, and I mean this genuinely, I would have been more on board with it if there was some kind of food that the crew, really, really wanted. They didn't even need it. It's not actually a requirement. But, the crew was so desperate for chocolate or whatever, that wasn't replicated, that they were willing to go down and deal with this horrible Nazi planet in order to get it. As opposed to, we need a magic mineral that has never been seen before or since in order to stabilize a warp core, or else we're screwed forever. I'll shut up about it. I apologize. And so, let me actually talk about one of the other problems this episode kind of has. It's very schizophrenic. And honestly, having read up a bit, I actually went out of my way to read up on the making of this episode a bit to try and understand why, and it makes perfect sense to me now having done so. This started as a pitch from two writers, okay? So, off the bat, we've got two writers involved. You probably already know where I'm going with this. Those two writers had it rewritten several times by Jerry Taylor. We're just going to leave her alone. I've talked bad about her enough. Star Trek Generations. Anyways, then we're going to move on from that. Jerry Taylor then handed it off to Lisa Klink, who then rewrote it, and then I actually forget the name of the last individual who did the page one, the page 3 end page rewrite. That's what it's called, end page rewrite of the episode. So all of these writers have had a hand in it. Sometimes that can be good. Sometimes, most of the time, that tends to be bad. And this episode is a good example of why. Because you have the emotional spectrum and the spectrum of quality of the writing and the episode just kind of goes all over the place, as the episode progresses. And it reaches the point where, like I said, it feels very schizophrenic. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. There are just as many face-palmingly bad scenes in this episode as there are truly good ones. And that's kind of my next problem with it. Now, I've actually only got 2 more notes here, believe it or not. So let's talk about the UPN. Some of you may not even have any context for this, so forgive me. But when Voyager was coming out, it was on a network called UPN. UPN, independently, the network, actually put out the trailers, for lack of a better term, the teaser videos that would go out for when a new Voyager episode was coming out. They spliced together and edited their own teasers. Voyager and the Star Trek staff had absolutely nothing to do with that, okay? I mention that because there are 2 big instances where that really came in and completely screwed over Voyager. This is one of them. For those of you who have remember it, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. Resistance was portrayed as this dark, horrible, gritty episode where the crew is being tortured one by one as they suffer indescribable torment, and then Janeway comes off and she's going to have to sell her body in order to save her crew and all this horrible stuff. It was so over the top and so badly done that even at that point people were like, huh? And it actually hurt the ratings for this episode significantly and made a lot of people not want to watch it initially. I remember that particular. I wonder if you could find it on YouTube now, because that would be hilarious to watch that again and just be like, huh? Because, yeah, it's no, you know? And so I'm not going to hold that against Voyager. I just wanted to comment on that because there's one other episode I'll be commenting on with regards to UPN's teasers, trailers, whatever you want to call it. That's an episode called Unity, and I'm sure some of you know what I mean by that. Let's talk about the thing that bothers me most about this episode. Yes, really. Even the nonsensical technobabble of the beginning, even the schizophrenic writing, even the fact that, there's the planet of the hats and there's the one guy who's always, we got Bob. Where'd you go, Bob? There you go. Bob over here is the only person anyone ever deals with. None of that really would have killed it for me so much as this one thing. Now, I've talked before about the fact that ships and the technology are my thing, and that's my line as far as believability and the things that irk me. We all have our things, especially in Star Trek. Trek fans, I've encountered hundreds of them, possibly thousands at this point in time. I've been around for a bit. And all of us have our own things that we just, it's like, I can't take this. I've talked about this before. It's funny because if you've been watching this series, you probably recognize the fact that I've actually referenced this episode several times, because what happens in this episode is the USS Voyager, an Intrepid-class warship, is held hostage effectively by a ground-based planet, which on several occasions is repeatedly emphasized to not have spatial travel. In other words, they don't have ships, they're just ground-based. They're landlocked. And they're holding hostage the Voyager crew and ship. Now, some of you out there can already be leaping to this defense, and I've already thought of a few defenses you could use against this. Defense number one, they were holding them hostage because of their conscience, because the Voyager crew, and especially Chakotay, would not be willing to undergo, the kind of malicious actions that would actually solve this problem. Possible. However, I disagree because this force has actively been a antagonistic force against the Voyager crew, and therefore, for all intents and purposes, can be discussed as an enemy. And of course, B, Chakotay's the one in charge of Voyager at the moment, and he's a Maquis commander. And really, I don't think I have to say anything else about that. If you understand enough about Voyager and Star Trek to have made that counter argument, I think I'm done. So let's just move on. Second defense that could be made, and this is the interesting one because this is what intrigued me about this episode at first, and the more I think about it, the more I find this premise intrigued. Why not have an episode where we have a planet that is aware of interstellar travel, is aware of extraterrestrial species, interacts with them on a regular basis, or else how would have Neelix known about them and had have interacted with them in the past? How else would he have known that this ship has come up in order to trade? It's very clear that they know about other life in the galaxy, but they have deliberately not gone to the stars because they are such a tightly controlled, fascist Nazi state, whatever, that they have tried to refuse travel to the stars because they know that doing so would make things more difficult to control. Now that premise actually intrigues me, believe it or not. Because what you have there is basically a keg that's just waiting to be lit for all intents and purposes in every way, societally, culturally, economically, militarily. I think that's fascinating. I think it should have been better done than, we have magic shields that can actually thwart the Voyager shields because they're metaphasic, which means they can go into the corona of a star. So, it's really useful. I'm sorry. And then they have, these cannons, ionic phasic cannons, which can destroy the hell out of Voyager, despite, I'm sorry, it's breaking my brain just thinking about this. The way they presented it is basically that the planet is superior to Voyager in basically every way, and the only way that Voyager actually succeeds in this one is because of luck, because they found that one storm. Excuse me. And because Janeway, by herself, with no weapons, managed to infiltrate the prison on the inside. And that's actually how they bring this down. Even though this place is capable of holding down the Voyager. Now, yes, I get it. You could argue that, a single individual, a guerrilla force, an infiltrator, a hunter, can accomplish what an army cannot. I'm not going to argue that. What I am going to argue is that the way this was presented was almost silly. And here's my biggest problem with everything I've been talking about. Like I said, this whole thing bothers me because it's just so unrealistic, even within the... It's so unbelievable. Let me use the correct term. It is so unbelievable, even within the confines of Star Trek and Voyager in particular. And Voyager's never exactly been believable with itself. What bothers me most about it is it takes me completely out of the episode. One moment I'm there like this, and I'm like, yes, and I'm watching these pathos and this tragedy of this person, and I'm interacting with him and Janeway, and we see more about Janeway's character as he interacts with her and she with him, and then we see more of, I haven't even talked about this yet, Tuvok and B'Elanna and their interactions with each other and their discussion, and they have so many wonderful lines. Tuvok's line about, we are successfully resisting them by not giving them information, we are fighting back, and B'Elanna's line about how she always assumed, that Vulcans didn't feel pain, and the two's interaction, it's great, yes! And then I'm just shoved out of the episode as hard as it can be by the fact that the planet suddenly sprouts death lasers that start shooting Voyager to 10% of its with 10% of its shield with a single volley. And then they're like, you have 2 minutes to leave before we will destroy your ship. What? And that's my problem with it. It destroys any sense of drama or pathos or intrigue with like the other 60% of the episode. The 40% that that intermixes that the core of the episode's great, but the rest of it just it bothers me so much I don't even have words for it anymore. I'm actually struggling to get these across to you. And then, and it all terminates with them. They do something that actually makes sense for me. Harry Kim's idea I actually like. Let's bombard the planet in several different ways, which will penetrate the shield at multiple points, and then we will beam down through one of those points. Okay, you know what? As far as Technobabble goes, that's actually really good, especially for Voyager. It's barely Technobabble at all. It is a sense-making solution to a problem that exists. We need to... So, let me lay this out for you in case you don't understand what I mean, because I feel like I'm skipping over this. We need to go here, okay? We can transport here, okay? There's a shield preventing us from going, and if we penetrate the shield, they'll know and they'll put people there. Let's penetrate multiple spots at once and then beam down through one of them so they don't know exactly where we are. It's a roll of the die, but it will work. That is the kind of using your brain's solution, problem-solving solution that I actually like, because it makes perfect sense, and it never requires, just inserting magic abstractly into the plot. As opposed to, we need this vial of stuff. Why? Because it makes our ship go, and we suddenly turned into the Pack-Leds. I just wanted... I know I sound derogatory, but I'm actually praising the episode for that, because that actually made sense. And then, of course, it immediately takes the sense-making plan and spits all over it and says, oh, nope, sorry, you're going to have to wait for Janeway to single-handedly win the day by herself. I know, I'm exaggerating a bit. I apologize. It just bothers me so much to see this kind of thing happen. One final note I want to add here. I like the coda of this episode. I know this is becoming a trend, too, about how many episodes where I don't like the episode, but the coda is great. I like the coda at the end of this episode, because the coda really speaks to Janeway's interactions with the gentleman and how much it's impacted her. Mulgrew, again, does a great job with this scene, where she is barely paying attention to the report from Kim. Kim is obviously happy to be telling her, that your ship is working and functional, and Janeway can barely focus on it because she is so emotionally impacted by the death of the man right in front of her eyes. And she gets that across really well, and her holding of the necklace, which she obviously re-procured from the rebel. Awesome. Very well done. Very well done. I like that. And there's one other thing I have to say positively about this episode, and you're probably going to make fun of me. I know. I have been a vocal person who has been against, a vocal opponent, there we go, of the Prime Directive as it is applied in Star Trek a lot. I don't want to get too much into that. I don't, because I know that a lot of you disagree with me on that, and that's okay. And I mean, it's very much a case-by-case thing for me, too. It's not like I disagree with the Prime Directive on paper. It's not like I disagree with the Prime Directive 100%. I just think most of the time it's applied incorrectly, just to put it bluntly. That's the synopsis of my opinion in a nutshell. But I like the fact that the Prime Directive never once came up in this episode. I like the fact that it was never even mentioned, because in my opinion, it shouldn't have been. Here's why. Under these circumstances, with the situation faced where her crew was in this dire situation, that made up problem at the beginning, and they're fighting a hostile force who is clearly, for all intents and purposes, declared a state of war, or at the very least a state of hostility against the Voyager crew. In that particular circumstances, the Prime Directive, in my opinion, does not apply anymore. In both circumstances. And when you have them combined, no, yeah, that's a no-brainer to me. So I like the fact that it wasn't even brought up. Now, did I like this episode then? No. But, as I said, do I like this episode now? A lot more than I thought I would. I really didn't think I would enjoy this episode nearly as much as I did when I was rewatching it. So this was a pleasant surprise for me, actually enjoying it as much as I did. What would I change? Resistance was going to be a funny one in the Imperium storyline because I really actually was going to flesh this out a lot. These guys here were actually going to be it wasn't going to be a ground-based, a landlocked species. It was actually going to be the very first interactions with the I suddenly can't think of their names. The Combine. Or no, not the Combine. The I suddenly can't think of my own thing's name. Anyways, this was going to be their first interaction with them. The Conclave, that was it. This is going to be their very first interaction with them, and it was going to be an interesting insight in them because, well, let's just leave that alone. What would I change? First of all, get rid of the artificial problem at the beginning. Let's make a genuine reason why the Voyager crew are so interested in dealing with this planet that is so hostile. Let's go ahead and leave them ground-based, because, you know what? No, let's not. I'm sorry. That bothers me so much. Just make them a hostile species, okay? Just make them confined to their solar system or whatever. Just make their only ships under the control of the military, and boom. Same exact thing is applied, okay? I know I liked the premise earlier, but honestly, from a writing perspective, it's much easier to just do it this way. So let's go ahead and make them a hostile alien force that has ships that are confined with us in the area. Let's also make them very malignant. And what I mean by that is it's very easy to make a force that is less technologically advanced than you, but still is a threat to you. Because if they have focused all of their advancement on military means and weapons, defenses, etc., they are probable to this is true in real life too, they are probable to actually be capable of hurting and injuring and even destroying you, even though you know so much more about everything else than they do, if you follow me. Voyager itself is actually a good example of this. The Star Trek, the Federation, is incredibly advanced in basically every field. Let's make these people very advanced just within the military. You get where I'm going with this. So let's say that they're landing here, and the very first thing that they actually want, all things considered, is something to do with not actually so much, nothing to do with the warp core. Let's just ignore that completely. Let's say there's some kind of chemicals they have, or some kind of nutrients they have, or something that they have here on this planet, and it's something they export on a fairly regular basis in order to fund their, Nazi military, in order to try and go ahead and keep their funding going. It's in order to keep their grip on the people. I would also, if I were inclined to, I would add another layer to this. It would be in my interest to say that while this is a very fascist government, that there is a reason for that. That this government is genuinely thinking that this is the best for its people, and that the resistance are people who are, actively terrorists rather than just freedom fighters. I know, people throw around those words a lot, but you get the implications with the tonality I'm using, right? So the government is trying to maintain this lockdown on everything because they were attacked in the past. Now, again, this isn't the Imperium, so let's go ahead and just say the Kazon used to prey on them. That's an easy answer. Or maybe the Vidians, which would be even worse. And so as a result, this government is under extreme lockdown internally and externally to ensure that no such forces ever manage to infiltrate or harm them in the future. And they've been in this way for the last, let's just say like a decade. Not too long. About the point of time at which the government is probably starting to collapse, all things considered, which would be a good time for this episode to happen. Just a little layer I would like to add there. Next thing I would change. I know that this is basically a bottle episode, and that's actually part of why there were no ships on the ground, on this ground-based people, actually. But you don't actually have to show the ships. I know that's a weird concept, but you really don't in a show like this. So why? Whoa! Oh, excuse me. Let's go ahead and make it so that the Voyager cruise has managed to has managed to slip the Voyager ship in through their patrols and is now lying in dormant, on a moon or whatever. And they can only come out during these particular intervals in order to intervene with their patrols because they found a way to mask them from their sensors. That makes plenty of sense to me. Again, Voyager is more advanced technologically overall than they are in the overall sense. So, okay, that makes sense. So they've managed to slip in. The crew have managed to land, and they're trying to get amount of this chemical. And of course, naturally, they need a large amount of it. The reason they're here clandestinely is because it was Neelix's suggestion that they do this rather than try to deal with the government, because the chemical in question, or the nutrient in question, or whatever, is something that's on their watch list because it was something that other alien races wanted and were willing to raid and steal for, and it's something that's used on the planet itself for something that the government doesn't agree with. What it is used for almost doesn't matter. You don't even have to say what it is in the course of the episode, but it's on the watch list for whatever reason. Therefore, the only people who actively have decent supplies of it are either the military themselves, which you'd have to steal from in order to procure, or the resistance, who is actually making it. Now, I would actually make it that they are going after the military. That's where the storehouses goes. All their interactions with the resistance weren't to trade it per se, for it per se. It was to trade with them the information and expertise needed in order to steal it from the military, in order to get that information to go get it. So they get in there. The heist goes poorly. We go ahead and have, B'Elanna and Tuvok kidnapped. I wouldn't change much of the character interaction scenes at all, hardly at all. Those two are still kidnapped. Janeway's still with the gentleman. All those scenes I would almost leave completely intact. I would then change the fact that Chakotay tries to negotiate with this person. It wouldn't fit with my vision of these people. In fact, frankly, I don't think it fit with this vision at all. I felt like those scenes were basically just padding. So let's eject that entirely and have all those scenes instead be Chakotay and the crew of the Voyager trying to think of a way to get in there, get those materials, get their crew back. And I would have one of the points be what's more important, getting the material or getting the crew, to which Chakotay would actually have to think about that. Because, both are important in their own right, and one of the hard choices a commander has to make is the sacrificing of crew for the good of the ship. Now, of course, that doesn't end up having to come into play, but I think I would go ahead and never actually answer. In fact, well, I'll get to that in a minute. So they go ahead and invade. They enact some kind of brilliant plan. No, I'm not going to think about it right now. Don't. It's not particularly relevant. If I sat down and actually wrote it out, I would do so. I'm not going to do so right now. Voyager enacts this brilliant plan that provides a distraction, which allows Janeway and the gentleman to try and infiltrate the prison. The distraction, that also further distracts whoever the local lord is, or region lord, or whatever. And so he, with their forces somewhat divided and their attention somewhat divided, we have, and the ships, out here, which are still dealing with whatever distraction Voyager just left on the moon. I don't know, maybe setting off. Oh, that's an idea. Maybe they were trying to do something where it made it look like they were setting off a nuke or something like similar to that on the moon, which would distract the ships. And of course, it wasn't actually there because they're not going to do that because of the ramifications. Blah 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 blah. Moving on. Ships are distracted. Voyager comes in. Voyager manages to beam up the minerals. Janeway managed to infiltrate the facility with the help of the distraction from Voyager, which was unintentional, I might add. The two didn't coordinate. This was just fine coincidence. Gets in there, gets them. They barely get out in time, and I would have the final dramatic scene between the gentleman and Janeway be on Voyager itself after having just barely escaped because the gentleman was injured in the escape. And then we have that wonderful thing. And then we have a coda, which I would only change in a tiny, tiny little bit because I want to add a scene to it. I don't know who would be best to ask. Tuvok might be a good choice. B'Elanna might be a good choice. I think I would probably go with B'Elanna if I had to put a number on it. B'Elanna and Chakotay are asking, and Chakotay would just say something almost offhanded, and it would. Robert Beltran can do this. I have faith in his acting ability. He would have to say in a manner that showed his relief. I'm so glad that the captain was able to enact her plan, and we were able to get you out. And B'Elanna says, "Why?" And then that point, Beltran would kind of, Chakotay would kind of clench up a bit, and she'd look at him strange and says, "What?" And he's like, "Well, for a while there, it was either you or the minerals." And she says, "Well, which did you pick?" And I wouldn't have him answer. I would actually have him just kind of look at her and then kind of walk off. No grin, no trying to lighten up the situation, just the seriousness of what a commander has to face and the implications of that. And B'Elanna's face, who would probably be treating this kind of like a light joke. Oh, well, which did you choose? And the Chakotay looks at her seriously, walks off, and we settle on B'Elanna's face before that scene's end, as her face just kind of goes down and she realizes the seriousness of it. And then we end on on Janeway and her last scene with the locket. So that's Resistance in a nutshell. Hope you liked my version. I know it's a little bit brief. I do apologize. Ever since I stopped writing the Imperium version, it's been harder and harder to do these. Anyways, I hope I will see you guys soon.